Hey guys, tonight we embark on a dusty, arduous, and probably quite smelly journey back to a 19th century Australian gold rush town. Forget your creature comforts, your running water, your Wi Fi. Imagine instead a landscape raw and bleeding, teeming with a chaotic swarm of fortune seekers from every corner of the globe, all chasing the glint of yellow in the dirt. The air is thick with anticipation, desperation, and the constant grinding soundtrack of picks against Earth. If you, with your 21st century immune system and penchant for, say, basic sanitation, were suddenly dropped into the middle of Canvas Town, 1853, well, let's just say your prospects for surviving the first week, let alone striking it rich, would be enthusiastically grim. You'd probably trade your smartphone for a bar of soap and a prayer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love knowing where these tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're finally here. After weeks, maybe months, of a bone-jarring, sea-tossing voyage across unforgiving oceans, and then an equally brutal overland trek by bullock dray, on horseback, or most likely, on your own two blistered feet. You've arrived. Or at least you think you have. This sprawling a chaotic settlement that mushrooms out before you bears little resemblance to any town you've ever known. This is Canvas Town, the ephemeral, pulsating heart of the Australian gold rush. A place born of feverish hope and raw, unadulterated opportunism. The first major gold rushes in Australia truly kicked off around 1851 with discoveries in places like Ophir in New South Wales. And then, even more spectacularly, in Victoria at Ballarat and Bendigo, triggering a human tidal wave that reshaped the continent. You've joined that wave, a tiny drop in an ocean of hopefuls. Your first impression is one of utter, bewildering chaos. There are no neat streets, no planned boulevards, no welcoming town square. Instead, a bewildering maze of tents stretches as far as your weary eyes can see. A sea of canvas, calico, rough-spun wool, and patched-together hides, all stained various shades of ochre from the relentless dust. They sprout at every conceivable angle, crammed together with no apparent logic, as if a giant had scattered a handful of dirty handkerchiefs across the ravaged landscape. The town planning, if you could call it that, appears to have been outsourced to a committee of particularly disoriented wombats. Some tents are grander affairs, boasting actual poles and guy ropes, while others are miserable lean-tos, little more than a blanket slung over a couple of precariously balanced branches. Smoke, a hazy blue veil, rises from countless makeshift chimneys and open fires, mingling with the ever-present dust to create an atmosphere you can practically chew. And the noise, it's a relentless percussive assault on your senses. The air thrums with the rhythmic thud of picks against stubborn earth, the grating screech of shovels on gravel, the creak and groan of primitive windlasses hauling buckets of pay dirt from unseen depths. Men shout to each other in a dozen different languages: English, Irish brogues, Scottish burrs, German, Italian, Chinese, American drawls, a veritable babble of the goldfields. Horses whinny, bullocks low, dogs bark incessantly. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rings out with metallic fury, and further off, you hear the splintering crash of another tree succumbing to the axe. Occasionally, a raucous burst of song, or perhaps a less harmonious drunken argument, erupts from one of the larger, more disreputable-looking tents that probably serves as an illicit grog shanty. It's the sound of 1,000 desperate endeavors all happening at once. Then the smells hit you. The dominant perfume is dust, fine, red, invasive dust that coats your clothes, clogs your nostrils, and grits between your teeth with every breath. Mingled with this is the acrid tang of wood smoke from countless cooking fires, The slightly rancid aroma of mutton fat perpetually sizzling in pans, and the heavier, yeastier scent of damper bread baking in camp ovens. Underneath it all, there's the undeniable musk of too many unwashed human bodies crammed too closely together, the pungent ammonia of animal dung, and if the wind shifts, perhaps the faint, damp, metallic tang of the disturbed earth from the diggings themselves, or the slightly medicinal scent of eucalyptus from the remaining trees that fringe this man-made scar. Personal hygiene standards here seem to be more aspirational than actual, a distant dream in a world where water is almost as precious as the gold itself. The people are a sight to behold. A river of humanity flows through the makeshift laneways. If you can call these narrow, winding tracks between tents laneways, men. Mostly, young men with stars still in their eyes and calluses yet to form on their hands. Fresh off the boat, their meager possessions slung on their backs. Older, harder men. Their faces leathered by sun and wind, their eyes narrowed with a mixture of hope and cynicism. Veterans perhaps of other rushes in other lands. Their clothing is a motley collection of rough serge, moleskin, flannel shirts, and battered hats, all coated in the ubiquitous dust. Women are fewer, but you see them too, and some looking as determined and hardy as any man. Others with a weary resilience etched onto their faces as they try to carve out some semblance of domesticity amidst the squalor. The main forms of currency here appear to be raw gold dust, unshakable hope, and a flurry of strongly worded complaints about everything from the price of flour to the audacity of the flies. You feel a profound sense of disorientation. Where do you even begin? There's no information booth, no welcoming committee, unless you count the buzzing cloud of flies that immediately takes an interest in you, or the shifty-looking fellow nearby trying to sell you a guaranteed map to the legendary Big One, crudely drawn on a piece of bark for an exorbitant price. Your first challenge, before you can even think about finding gold, is simply to find a patch of unoccupied earth, hopefully not downstream from someone else's latrine trench or directly on top of an ant's nest, where you can pitch your own flimsy shelter against the elements and the equally unpredictable nature of your new neighbors. Looking around, you see how the land itself has been brutalized. The native bush, with its unique flora and fauna, has been unceremoniously shouldered aside. Trees are felled haphazardly for firewood, tent poles, and mine props. The ground is pockmarked with countless shallow pits, deeper shafts, and sprawling mullock heaps, the piles of discarded earth and rock. Creeks that once ran clear are now choked with mud and tailings, their waters a sickly, uninviting brown. It's a stark, raw testament to the single-minded pursuit that has drawn everyone here. Some of the new arrivals, bless their ill-prepared hearts, in their eagerness or ignorance, attempt to set up their rudimentary camps in the most astonishingly unsuitable locations, right in the middle of what is clearly a dry creek bed, prime for a flash flood, or perilously close to the lip of an abandoned, unfenced mine shaft. You can almost hear the old-timers chuckling, or perhaps sighing, at the sheer learning curve some of these greenhorns are about to experience. The colonial authorities, back in the distant, civilized cities, are still grappling with how to manage this unprecedented explosion of population and activity. Historians still argue whether the initial administrative response to these gold rushes was a case of deliberate, perhaps even strategic, neglect, allowing the fever to run its course, or if they were simply, and understandably, overwhelmed by the sheer scale and speed of events. Their efforts at imposing order a mere drop in the chaotic ocean of the rush. For you, standing here at the edge of this raw, pulsating canvas town, officialdom feels a million miles away. All that matters is the dirt under your feet, the hope in your heart, and the daunting, exhilarating, terrifying prospect of the daily grind that awaits. That daunting, exhilarating prospect of the daily grind, which settled upon you amidst the bedlam of Canvas Town, begins not with the first swing of your pickaxe, not quite yet, but with an even more fundamental, frantic, and desperate scramble, the fight for a patch of earth to call your own, however temporarily. Now that you've managed to carve out a sliver of space for your miserable tent, probably after a minor skirmish with a disgruntled goat, or a man who insisted that particular patch was reserved for his imaginary friend, the real gamble commences. It's time to stake your claim in this vast, unforgiving earthly lottery. So, what exactly is a claim in theory? It's a designated parcel of ground, a tiny square of the Queen's land, which you, as a hopeful digger, are entitled to work in pursuit of that elusive yellow metal. The size of these claims varied from goldfield to goldfield and evolved over time, but early on they were often pitifully small, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, or 10 by 10. Imagine a space not much bigger than a generous picnic blanket, and that's your entire kingdom of possibility. The official process for staking one often involved a fair bit of hopeful squinting at the sun-baked earth. Some vaguely straightish wooden pegs hammered into the unyielding ground with a rock, and a silent, fervent prayer that your immediate neighbor wasn't secretly 6 inches taller with a significantly longer measuring tape. The real frenzy, the true spectacle of desperation and raw human energy, occurred during a new rush. Picture this, a whisper starts. A rumor ripples through the established diggings. Gold, big gold, has been struck a few miles away. Up by Dead Man's Creek or over on Wilson's Hill. Suddenly tools are downed. Half-eaten meals abandoned. A tide of men, a human stampede, surges towards the new El Dorado. You're swept along. Your heart pounding, lungs burning, driven by the primal fear of missing out. Arriving at the new ground, it's every man for himself. You frantically search for a promising-looking patch, trying to gauge its potential by the color of the soil, the type of rocks, or more often, simply by its proximity to where the first lucky strike was supposedly made. Once you've picked your spot, you mark it out with whatever comes to hand. Crude wooden pegs whittled with your sheath knife, perhaps a shallow trench hastily gouged around the perimeter with the heel of your boot, or by blazing nearby trees if any are still standing. Some bold or foolish souls might simply leave a shovel or a pickaxe stuck in the ground as a marker, a rather optimistic gesture in a place where unattended tools had a habit of developing legs. Haste and the appearance of active possession were everything. This is where the earthly lottery aspect truly hits home. There are no guarantees. The ground beneath your feet is a geological mystery, an ancient secret jealously guarded. You could stake your claim right next to a spot that's yielding ounces of nuggets a day. A veritable jeweler's shop, as they called it, only to find your own tiny patch is stubbornly, heartbreakingly barren. The gold-bearing leads, those ancient, buried riverbeds where the heaviest gold settled, could twist and turn, narrow and widen with infuriating unpredictability. One side of an imaginary line, your side, might yield nothing but calluses and despair, while 2 feet away, your smug neighbor, Kevin, is pulling out nuggets the size of your thumb and planning his retirement. It's enough to make a grown man weep into his lukewarm, fly-seasoned tea. Of course, there were supposed to be rules. The colonial authorities, in their wisdom, attempted to impose some order. To legally dig for gold, you were required to purchase a miner's right or a license. This is a crucial historical fact in Victoria in the early 1850s. For instance, this license cost a hefty 30 shillings a month, payable in advance, regardless of whether you found a single speck of gold. This fee was a massive source of resentment amongst the diggers, many of whom saw it as unjust taxation without representation, a burden imposed by a distant government that offered little in return by way of services or protection. It was one of the key grievances that would eventually flare into open rebellion at the Eureka Stockade. But for now, it's just another worry eating at your already thin purse. The man tasked with enforcing these regulations and attempting to settle the inevitable disputes was the Gold Commissioner. He and his troop of Goldfield police, the Traps, or Joes as they were often disparagingly called, were the long arm of the law, or at least its slightly overstretched and often rather grubby fingertip. The Gold Commissioner, bless his undoubtedly harried soul, was often viewed as a somewhat mythical creature by the average digger, rarely spotted when you actually needed him. occasionally dispensing Solomon-like judgments from horseback, but mostly just trying to avoid being trampled in the latest rush or buried under a metaphorical mountain of claim boundary disagreements and complaints about stolen wash dirt, and disputes were as common as flies on a hot day. With boundaries often vaguely marked by a couple of wobbly sticks or a line scuffed in the dirt, arguments over encroachment were constant. "That's my dirt, you thievin' scoundrel," would be a common refrain, often followed by less polite suggestions and the brandishing of shovels. Claim jumping, the audacious act of sneaking onto someone else's claim, especially if it was known to be rich and temporarily unattended, was a popular, if highly perilous, local pastime. The potential prize was a quick fortune. The potential penalty could range from a severe beating to being drummed off the goldfield. Or worse, rough digger justice, administered by an impromptu committee of one's peers, was often swifter and more final than anything the gold commissioner could offer. Even the act of staking your claim was hard physical labor. You're not just strolling through a park. The ground is uneven, littered with rocks, sharp stones, and prickly vegetation. You're probably doing this under a blazing Australian sun, your throat parched, sweat stinging your eyes. You hammer in your pegs, your hands already raw, your back aching from the journey, all the while keeping a wary eye on those around you, wondering if the bloke next to you is eyeing your chosen spot with a covetous gleam. Some diggers, in their desperation or perhaps guided by a touch of whimsy, employed less than scientific methods for selecting their golden patch. For a quirky tidbit, you might see a fellow earnestly consulting a twitching divining rod made from a forked eucalyptus branch, or another taking advice from a self-proclaimed prophet who claimed to see visions of nuggets in his breakfast porridge. Others might look for signs in nature, a particular configuration of quartz pebbles, the direction an eagle flew, or the way the local ants built their nests, believing these held the key to subterranean riches. Unsurprisingly, these methods generally had roughly the same success rate as meticulously studying a geological map, which was to say, mostly disappointment, punctuated by rare, bewildering, and often short-lived triumph. Historians still argue whether the claim system, for all its inherent chaos and the frequent injustices it produced, was ultimately a relatively democratic method of distributing access to this sudden mineral wealth, giving the common man a shot, or if from the very outset, it inherently favored those who arrived with more capital, better equipment, stronger gangs of mates, or simply a more aggressive and intimidating demeanor. Your claim, once marked, was your tiny, dusty kingdom of hope. And like any fledgling kingdom, it came with its own set of anxieties, constant border disputes, the threat of invasion by opportunistic neighbors, and the persistent, nagging fear that the real motherlode, the life-changing bonanza you'd cross the world for, was actually located about 3 feet to your left, well within the sovereign territory of that annoyingly cheerful Kevin. The lottery had begun. So, your tiny, dusty kingdom of hope is marked out, pegged against the odds and the envious glances of your neighbors. Now comes the part where that shimmering hope meets the decidedly harsh reality of the Australian earth, where dreams of easily plucked nuggets collide with stubborn clay, unyielding rock, and the sheer, back-breaking volume of dirt that stands between you and potential fortune. It's time to arm yourself, not with the romantic swords and shields of storybook kingdoms, but with the humble, yet utterly essential, tools of the 19th century gold digger, the sweat-stained steel and rough-hewn timber that will soon become aching extensions of your own protesting body. Your most basic and indispensable companions in this gritty enterprise form a simple, yet formidable trio: the pick, the shovel, and the pan. You heft the pickaxe, its wooden handle is rough against your palms, its iron head heavy and brutally efficient. This is your primary weapon against the compacted soil, the tangled tree roots, and the layers of rock that might guard the gold-bearing wash dirt. The clang of your pick striking stone, the dull thud as it bites into clay, the jarring shock that travels up your arms with every blow. These sounds will become the soundtrack to your days, a rhythm of relentless exertion. Your basic toolkit, You quickly realize one consists of this pick: a shovel, a pan, and an almost superhuman capacity for enduring back pain, and the soul-crushing disappointment of frequently finding nothing more than gravel and increasingly sore muscles. Next comes the shovel, your implement for moving mountains, or at least your personal, ever-growing molehill of excavated earth. Whether it's a long-handled shovel for deeper digging or a shorter one for closer work, its broad steel blade will scoop and lift countless tons of dirt over the coming weeks and months. You'll use it to clear away the worthless overburden, to load precious wash dirt into buckets or onto the head of your cradle, and to fill in abandoned holes, or more likely, to create new ones. The repetitive strain, the way the handle rubs blisters that then harden into calluses, the sheer weight of earth moved one shovelful at a time. It's a Sisyphean task that builds muscle and tests resolve in equal measure. And then, the iconic gold pan. Usually a wide, shallow dish made of iron or tin. This is where your first real tangible connection with the possibility of gold occurs. You scoop a manageable amount of promising-looking dirt, the wash dirt, into your pan. Add water from a nearby creek or a precious bucketful you've carried, and begin the delicate, almost hypnotic process of panning. You swirl the mixture, allowing the water to carry away the lighter sand, silt, and clay. With practiced flicks of the wrist, you gradually work the heavier materials down, washing away the dross layer by layer. It's a skill that takes time to master. Too vigorous and you might lose fine gold. Too timid and you'll never get through the muck. Your back is bent, your eyes strained, searching for that telltale glint. The gold pan is your first true window into the soul of the earth. Mostly, it shows you mud, a few uninteresting pebbles, perhaps a lost button from some previous unfortunate. But then, very, very rarely, as the last of the black sand washes away, you see it a tiny yellow flake, a speck, a miniature sunbeam winking up at you from the bottom of the pan. That's color. And in that instant, every ache, every doubt, every fly that's tried to take up residence in your ear is momentarily forgotten. As you become more established, or if you join forces with a few mates as teamwork was often essential, you might graduate to more sophisticated, though still decidedly low-tech, equipment. The cradle, or rocker, is a common sight on the goldfields. It's essentially a wooden box, about 3 or 4 feet long, mounted on curved rockers like a child's cradle. At one end is a sieve or hopper where you dump the wash dirt. Water is ladled over it, and as one man rocks the cradle back and forth with a rhythmic, sloshing motion, the water washes the finer material through the sieve and down a sloping tray. This tray has riffles, small transverse bars of wood, or sometimes a piece of coarse blanket or sheepskin, designed to trap the heavier gold particles while the lighter waste flows out the other end. A cradle is like a hyperactive wooden baby that you constantly feed dirt and water, fervently hoping it will burp up a little nugget of gold. It mostly just burps up more mud and demands more vigorous rocking, much like some actual human babies, come to think of it. For those fortunate enough to have access to a steady stream of water, a sluice box, or long tom, offers an even more efficient way to process larger quantities of dirt. This is a long, inclined wooden trough, sometimes 10 or 12 feet in length, again fitted with riffles along its bottom. A continuous flow of water is directed down the sluice, and wash dirt is shoveled in at the top. The water does most of the work, washing the material down the slope, with the gold hopefully getting trapped behind the riffles. Operating a long tom is usually a team effort, with some digging and shoveling, others keeping the water flowing and the sluice clear. If the surface alluvial gold proves elusive, or if you hear tales of richer deposits lying deeper, you might embark on the perilous task of shaft sinking. This involves digging vertically downwards, sometimes tens, even hundreds of feet, through layers of earth and rock to reach ancient, buried riverbeds where gold might have concentrated. It's dangerous work. Shafts can collapse, foul air can accumulate, and water can flood in. To haul the excavated dirt and occasionally unfortunate diggers out of these increasingly deep holes, you'd use a windlass. This is a simple but brutally effective hand-cranked winch, A horizontal wooden drum supported by two uprights, around which a rope is wound. One or two men on the surface would monotonously turn the cranks hour after hour, hauling up heavy buckets of dirt sent up by their mates toiling in the claustrophobic darkness below. It's the kind of labor that makes you appreciate the simple joy of just being able to stand upright. The windlass, because who needs a fancy gym membership when you can spend 12 hours a day hauling buckets of wet, uncooperative clay out of a 50-foot hole in the ground? It really tones the despair muscles, if nothing else. From the bottom of these shafts, miners might then dig horizontal tunnels, or drives, following the presumed course of the gold-bearing lead, working by candlelight in cramped, often unstable conditions. And for particularly stubborn, clay-rich wash dirt that refuses to give up its gold easily, you'd encounter the puddling machine. These were often circular troughs, sometimes horse-powered, where a heavy harrow or rake would be dragged around, churning the clay with water into a thick slurry, allowing the gold to separate and sink. Hand-powered versions, essentially a tub vigorously stirred with a forked stick, also existed. It was messy, muddy work, but sometimes necessary to liberate the finer gold particles trapped in sticky clay. Acquiring these tools is your next challenge. If you've arrived with a bit of capital, you can buy them from one of the opportunistically priced stores that have sprung up, but be prepared to pay through the nose. A simple shovel that cost a shilling in Melbourne might be 10 times the price on the diggings. Many diggers, especially those arriving with little more than the clothes on their backs, have to improvise, making crude tools from salvaged timber and scrounged bits of metal, or entering into partnerships where tools are shared. This led to a significant historical fact. The early, easily won surface gold favored the individual with simple tools. But as the rushes progressed to deeper leads requiring more complex equipment like windlasses, pumps, and puddling machines, mining increasingly required more capital, more organized labor, and often led to the formation of small partnerships or cooperative mining companies. Maintenance is constant. Pick heads become blunt and need resharpening, a task often done by heating them in a fire and hammering them back into shape. Wooden handles split and need replacing or binding with strips of hide or wire. Diggers become remarkably resourceful, developing skills as amateur blacksmiths, carpenters, and engineers out of sheer necessity. Some of their improvised repairs are marvels of ingenuity, while others are hilariously precarious. I fixed the main support for the windlass with a bit of greenhide, a tent peg, and what I sincerely hope was just a particularly sturdy piece of driftwood. Should hold, probably. Best not to stand directly underneath it during the lunch rush. This necessity for self-reliance and the unique challenges of the environment led to some quirky innovations and attachments. You might see a digger who has developed an almost superstitious bond with a particular tool, a lucky pan that has yielded good color before, or a pickaxe handle worn smooth and dark by years of sweat and toil, an item they'd never dream of lending out. Some might customize their tools with peculiar modifications they swear improve efficiency, though these often look more like abstract sculpture than functional improvements. Historians still argue about the true average yield per digger using these varied tools and techniques. While newspapers back in Britain or America might be full of sensational stories of men unearthing monstrous nuggets and making instant fortunes, what was the more common daily reality for the thousands toiling with their picks? Pans and cradles. How much gold dust, on average, did a man need to find just to cover the exorbitant cost of his food, his license, and the wear and tear on his tools, let alone send anything home or save for a brighter future? It's a complex calculation, but for many, the daily grind yielded far more sweat than gold. After a day of that kind of sweat-drenching, muscle-screaming labor, wrestling with pick, shovel, and cradle under the relentless Australian sun, your thoughts, what's left of them after the sheer physical exhaustion, inevitably turn to home. But home on the 19th century Australian goldfields is a very, very relative term. Forget the comforting solidity of 4 brick walls and a soundly tiled roof. Your palace, your sanctuary, your refuge from the daily grind and the incessant buzzing of flies is, more often than not, A flimsy, drafty, and profoundly uncomfortable tent. So, let's part the dusty canvas flap. Try not to trip over the guy rope that's probably secured with a suspiciously wobbly rock, and crawl inside to experience the unique and often dubious joys of ragged domesticity in Canvas Town. Your dwelling, if you're like most new arrivals, is a rudimentary affair. It might be a proper canvas tent, bought at an extortionate price from a ship's captain or a canny storekeeper. Or perhaps it's made of cheaper, less waterproof calico, which has the charming habit of weeping condensation on cold nights, giving you a personal indoor rain shower. For the truly down on their luck or the very recent arrivals, home might be little more than a couple of blankets or a tarpaulin slung over a rope tied between two obliging gum tree saplings, or a crude lean-to fashioned from bark stripped from nearby trees, assuming any trees are still standing within a reasonable foraging distance. Some of the more established residents, those who've been here a few months and perhaps even found a bit of color, might have graduated to a slightly more robust hut built from rough-sawn timber slabs, often with a canvas or bark roof. But for you starting out, it's most likely canvas and not a lot of it. These tents are often tiny, offering just enough room to lie down, and perhaps, if you're lucky, to stand up in the middle if you're not overly tall. Privacy is a foreign concept. You're likely sharing this cramped space with one, two, or even three mates, the companions you've thrown your lot in with, sharing labor, expenses, and far too much personal space. The floor is simply the bare earth, perhaps softened slightly by a scattering of dried gum leaves or a thin, lice-infested blanket if you're feeling luxurious. Furniture is minimal to non-existent. A battered tin trunk might hold your meager worldly possessions and double as a seat. A rough packing case might serve as a table, and your bed is whatever patch of slightly less lumpy ground you can claim for the night. Interior design in Canvas Town, you discover, mostly involves creative arrangements of existing dirt piles and trying to remember which amorphous lump under your shared blanket is supposed to be your pillow and which is just a particularly large and possibly disgruntled native beetle. Daily life within this canvas bubble is an adventure in discomfort. You wake before dawn, often shivering, the inside of the tent damp with cold condensation that drips onto your face with irritating persistence. If it rained overnight, you might find a small puddle forming by your feet, or that your one spare shirt, optimistically hung from a tent pole, is now soggier than when you last washed it, which was, let's be honest, several weeks ago. Cooking is usually done outside over an open campfire, a constant battle against wind, dust, and thieving kookaburras. In truly foul weather, you might attempt to boil a billy of tea or fry a piece of mutton on a small brazier inside the tent, quickly filling the confined space with eye-watering smoke and the very real risk of setting the whole flimsy structure, and possibly your beard, alight. Your tent a glorious canvas palace offering almost zero effective protection from the extremes of heat, cold, rain, a legion of inquisitive insects, or perhaps most distressingly, your primary tent mate's snoring, which you're convinced could rival a distressed koala trapped in a particularly resonant didgeridoo. The Australian climate throws everything it has at your inadequate shelter. In summer, the sun beats down mercilessly, turning your tent into a stifling, airless oven by mid-morning. You emerge, gasping, feeling like a slowly baking loaf of damper. Winter nights, conversely, can be shockingly cold, with sharp frosts that leave the canvas stiff and brittle. Rain, when it comes, often arrives in torrential downpours, quickly turning the ground to mud, overwhelming any pretense of drainage, and finding every tiny hole or weak seam in your canvas. You huddle inside, listening to the drumming on the roof, feeling the damp seep in, and wondering if you'll need to build an ark by morning. And then there's the wind. Always the wind, whipping across the exposed plains, tugging at your guy ropes, threatening to send your entire boat sailing off towards Tasmania, or just flapping the canvas with a maddening, incessant roar that makes sleep impossible. And through it all, the dust. Fine. Red. persistent dust that infiltrates every crack and crevice, coats every surface, gets into your food, your water, your lungs. Attempting to keep your tent clean is an exercise in utter futility, like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup during a cyclone. Eventually, you just sigh and accept the dust as a new, unwelcome, and incredibly clingy flatmate who never contributes to the rent. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this ragged domesticity is sanitation, or rather the almost complete lack thereof. There are no neat rows of portable toilets, no sewage systems. Rudimentary latrine trenches might be dug on the periphery of the settlement, but these are often inadequate, overflowing, and an olfactory offense to anyone downwind, more often. Answering the call of nature involves a perilous expedition to find a vaguely private bush that hasn't already been designated as a public convenience by 17 other individuals and a curious family of goannas. Waste disposal is equally haphazard. Food scraps. Empty tins once tinned goods become more common, and general rubbish are often simply tossed outside the tent, creating breeding grounds for flies, rats, and other unsavory critters. Personal hygiene is a luxury few can afford or maintain. Water, as we'll explore, is often scarce and precious, certainly too precious to waste on regular bathing. A quick, furtive dip in a muddy, likely polluted creek is often the best one can manage. Lice, fleas, and other tiny, unwelcome guests are common companions, passed around as freely as rumors of new gold strikes. It's a historical fact that epidemic diseases like dysentery, often called the colonial fever or the blight, typhoid, and diphtheria were rampant on the goldfields due to these appalling sanitary conditions. Contaminated water supplies and the sheer density of the population, leading to tragically high mortality rates, especially among the vulnerable, like children who had been brought to the fields. Yet, amidst this squalor and hardship, you see small, poignant attempts to create a semblance of home, of ragged domesticity. A man might carefully pin a faded picture of a loved one from halfway across the world to the inside of his tent. You might see someone painstakingly mending a torn shirt with clumsy, unpracticed stitches, or diligently trying to coax a few sorry-looking vegetables to grow in a patch of dirt scraped clear near their tent. The routines of preparing a meager meal, sharing a billy of tea with a mate, or quietly whittling a piece of wood in the evening. These small rituals become anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Within the close confines of a shared tent, bonds of mateship are forged, often stronger than steel, built on shared labor, shared hopes, and shared misery. Stories are swapped, frustrations aired, and dreams of striking it rich are whispered in the flickering candlelight. Of course, such enforced proximity can also lead to arguments, simmering resentments over a stolen piece of damper or an unfair division of labor. But mostly, there's a sense of pulling together against the odds. For a quirky tidbit, some diggers, yearning for a touch of individuality or perhaps just desperate for better weatherproofing, would try to personalize their drab canvas dwellings. You might see tents painted with crude depictions of flags, animals, good luck symbols, or boastful slogans like "Sure enough gold here" or "The Ballarat Bruisers." Others might try to coat their canvas with a homemade mixture of clay and flour, hoping to make it more waterproof, a concoction that probably cracked and flaked off in the sun but demonstrated a certain dogged ingenuity. Historians still argue about the profound psychological impact these prolonged, incredibly harsh, and insanitary living conditions had on the diggers. Did the shared hardship primarily foster a spirit of resilience, egalitarianism, and ingenuity? Or did the relentless discomfort, disease, and disappointment contribute more significantly to widespread despair, rampant alcoholism, and a general coarsening or even breakdown of social norms in many individuals? It was likely a complex mixture of both, a daily endurance test that shaped character in ways both admirable and deeply challenging. For now, you just pull your threadbare blanket a little tighter. Try to ignore the mysterious scratching sound coming from under your bunk. Best not to investigate and hope that tomorrow, just maybe tomorrow, your luck will finally turn. The main difference you reflect between being inside your tent and outside your tent is often just the slightly higher concentration of your own personal brand of hopeful misery and a marginally reduced, but by no means eliminated, chance of being immediately and painfully trodden on by a passing bullock or an overly enthusiastic fellow digger rushing off to the latest rumored strike. That hope for your luck to finally turn, the one you whisper to yourself in the cold, pre-dawn gloom of your shared tent, needs fuel. After a night spent battling condensation drips, the persistent attentions of various six-legged intruders, and the resonant symphony of your mate's snoring, which you're now convinced is an experimental form of geological surveying, your thoughts, and your rumbling stomach turn inevitably to the matter of sustenance. But if you were fondly imagining a hearty, farmhouse-style breakfast to power your day of back-breaking toil, you might want to significantly adjust your culinary expectations. Welcome, my friend, to the often monotonous, invariably expensive, and occasionally downright revolting world of Goldfield's grub. The cornerstone of your diet, the holy trinity of Goldfield's cuisine, you quickly discover consists of three noble, if somewhat uninspiring, staples: mutton, tea, and damper. Let's start with the mutton. Sheep were relatively plentiful in colonial Australia, and their meat formed the bulk of the protein available to the digger. But this wasn't the tender, prime lamb you might picture. More often, it was stringy, tough, and suspiciously mature mutton from sheep that had clearly lived long, eventful lives before their final, unceremonious journey to the diggings. You'll see it sold by opportunistic butchers operating from behind a fly-blown canvas screen, hacked into unappetizing chunks, often at eye-watering prices. You'll cook it yourself, most likely impaled on a stick and roasted over your smoky campfire until it's charred on the outside and still suspiciously pink within. Or perhaps boiled endlessly in a tin pot with a bit of water until it achieves a certain gray, rubbery consistency. Sometimes, if you're feeling particularly flush or careless with your fat supply, you might fry it in a pan, the smell of sizzling mutton fat becoming one of the defining aromas of the diggings. The Goldfields diet, you soon learn, is quite simple mutton. Mutton. And then, for a delightful change of pace, slightly more mutton. Sometimes it was suspiciously old mutton, sometimes impressively stringy mutton, and on special occasions. Is this actually mutton, or did someone cleverly disguise a well-boiled work boot mutton? A true culinary adventure, every single meal. Accompanying your mutton, and indeed every other moment of your waking life, is tea. Strong, black, and brewed in a smoke-blackened billy can directly over the flames. Tea is the universal lubricant of the Goldfields. It's often sweetened with coarse, dark sugar if you can afford it, and if the ants haven't claimed it first. It's your morning eye-opener, your midday reviver, your evening comfort. It washes down the dust, warms you on cold nights, and provides a brief, steaming respite from the relentless grind. Without tea, the entire gold rush might have ground to a halt from sheer misery and dehydration. And then there's damper. Damper. This is the ubiquitous bread of the Australian bush, and by extension, the Goldfields. The recipe is simplicity itself: flour, water, and a pinch of salt if you're lucky enough to have some. You mix it into a stiff dough, flatten it into a rough disc, and then cook it either directly in the hot ashes of your campfire, leading to a delightfully crunchy, ash-encrusted exterior, or, if you possess such a luxury, in a heavy cast-iron camp oven nestled amongst the coals. The result is a dense, heavy, often rather chewy bread that can be surprisingly filling. Damper is your constant companion, eaten with a greasy chunk of mutton, smeared with treacle molasses if you're feeling extravagant, or simply used to mop up the last dregs of your tea. It's a bread that could, and often did, double as a serviceable doorstop, an effective paperweight for your mining license during a sudden gust of wind, or, in a particularly desperate situation, A surprisingly effective, if somewhat crumbly, bludgeoning instrument. Truly a versatile culinary masterpiece. Variety, as you might have guessed, is not the spice of life on the goldfields. Fresh fruit and vegetables are almost mythical creatures, so rare and outrageously expensive that spotting a genuine, non-hallucinatory carrot would be akin to encountering a unicorn. You'd probably feel compelled to capture it, exhibit it in a small, reverent shrine, and charge fellow diggers a shilling a peek. This almost complete lack of fresh produce leads to widespread nutritional deficiencies. With scurvy, that old sailor's scourge caused by a lack of vitamin C, becoming a common and debilitating ailment. This is a grim historical fact, the prevalence of scurvy on the diggings, with its attendant symptoms of bleeding gums, loosened teeth, and debilitating weakness, highlighted the severe and dangerous imbalance in the typical digger's diet. Everything costs a fortune. Flour, sugar, salt, a precious rasher of bacon, a tin of sardines. These are luxury goods. Their prices inflated by the vast distances they must be transported by slow, creaking bullock drays, and by the unbridled opportunism of the storekeepers who know you have little choice but to pay up or go hungry. The local storekeeper's unofficial motto for pricing strategy seems to be, if you have to ask the price, you clearly can't afford it. And even if you don't ask, you probably still can't afford it. But I'll generously sell it to you anyway, on the vague, collateral-free promise of some of that lovely, hypothetical future gold you might find. You might try your hand at hunting, a kangaroo or a few birds, if you have a firearm. The skill and the considerable time to spare from your digging. Some might even experiment with foraging for edible native plants, though this requires a level of botanical knowledge most new chums lack, and runs the risk of an unpleasant or even fatal mistake. More often, you pool your meager resources with your mates, sharing the cooking duties and the cost of provisions. Your cooking facilities are as rudimentary as your tent. The open campfire is your kitchen. You learn to balance your billy can on a couple of well-placed rocks, to judge the heat of the coals for baking your damper, and to accept that a certain amount of ash, grit, and the occasional inquisitive insect will inevitably become an integral part of every meal. A balanced meal on the diggings usually means you've successfully managed not to spill your entire cup of precious tea, while simultaneously attempting to fend off a squadron of particularly determined flies dive-bombing your piece of greasy mutton. And the revolting aspect isn't just about monotony. The quality of the food itself can be highly questionable. That mutton might have been hanging in the sun a little too long, attracting more than just your attention. In the summer heat, fly-blown meat is a constant concern. Your flour, if you don't store it meticulously, and how can you in a leaky tent, might be enlivened by the presence of countless weevils. Adding an unexpected, crunchy protein supplement to your damper? You just tell yourself it's extra seasoning. Beyond tea and often dubious water, the other main beverage is, of course, grog. Spirits like rum, brandy, or some unidentifiable fiery concoction, often of appalling quality and likely adulterated with anything from tobacco juice to chili powder to give it a kick, are sold, usually illicitly, from sly grog shanties. These are often just particularly disreputable tents run by shady characters, charging outrageous prices for a measure of liquid oblivion. It's a common escape from the hardship and disappointment, but one that frequently leads to fights, debt, and further misery. For a quirky tidbit, in their desperate craving for something different, or perhaps to impress their mates with their culinary prowess and access to rare ingredients. Some diggers would concoct truly strange delicacies. You might hear tell of a duff, a sort of boiled sweet pudding made with flour and fat, perhaps with a few precious dried currants thrown in if someone had recently struck it moderately lucky. Or leather jackets, which were incredibly thin, tough pancakes cooked on a shovel blade over the fire, and for a quick protein hit, there was always the bushman's oyster, simply a raw egg, if you could get one. Swallowed whole. Bon appetit. Historians still argue about the precise weighting of factors contributing to the poor health of the diggers. To what extent did this notoriously inadequate and monotonous diet directly impact their physical productivity and susceptibility to disease? Versus other critical environmental factors such as the appalling sanitation, contaminated water sources, and the sheer relentless overwork, it's generally agreed, however, that the Goldfields grub, day in and day out, was a major contributing factor to the pervasive hardship and the often shortened lives of those who chase the dream of gold. You chew on your leathery mutton, sip your smoky tea, and dream not of nuggets but of a simple, fresh apple. That often questionable, always monotonous Goldfields grub, washed down with smoky tea, does little to quench a deeper thirst, the desperate daily need for water, not just for drinking, cooking, and the occasional aspirational wash, but for the very act of winning gold itself. Your cradle, your pan, your sluice box, they are all utterly useless without a generous supply of H2O. So, with your belly rumbling from a breakfast of leathery mutton and damper that could moor a small ship, you now confront one of the most persistent and challenging realities of the Australian goldfields: the agonizing scarcity of clean, life-sustaining water. Australia, as you're rapidly discovering, can be a harsh and unforgiving mistress. The climate is one of dramatic extremes, with long, scorching summers and unpredictable rainfall. When gold was struck, it was rarely next to a pristine, ever-flowing alpine spring. More often, the diggings were located in dusty, arid regions where permanent water sources were few and far between. Any existing creeks or rivers in the vicinity of a new rush were quickly descended upon by thousands of thirsty diggers and their even thirstier mining equipment. Within weeks, sometimes days, these once clear streams would be transformed into turgid, muddy sluices, choked with the tailings from countless cradles, polluted by human and animal waste, and generally resembling a rather depressing, elongated puddle of brown despair. Your daily water allowance, hauled in a bucket from such a source, often looks like a forgotten science experiment, a murky, brownish liquid that you fervently hope is mostly H2O and not, say, 70% suspended particulate matter, 20% disgruntled tadpole residue, and a worrying 10% of what your upstream neighbor had for breakfast. The search for drinkable water becomes a daily quest. Natural waterholes or springs, if any exist, are quickly fouled or depleted. Some enterprising diggers might try sinking wells, but this is a gamble. The water found is often brackish, bitter, or simply non-existent. The hole a dry testament to wasted effort? During prolonged dry spells, which are all too common, the situation becomes dire. The price of water skyrockets. Enterprising, or perhaps just opportunistic, individuals known as water carters emerge, hauling barrels of dubious-looking liquid on drays from distant, hopefully cleaner, sources, or sometimes just from a slightly less obviously polluted section of the same overworked creek a few miles upstream. They sell their precious cargo by the bucketful at prices that make flour and sugar look like bargains. Water truly becomes liquid gold. These water carters, the original purveyors of artisanal, small batch, and frequently suspiciously cloudy hydration, often charging more per gallon for their slightly filtered through a dirty sock creek water than a modern-day city barista charges for a single-origin, deconstructed, ethically ambiguous macchiato. The sheer quantity of water needed for gold washing is staggering. Your simple pan uses a fair bit, but a cradle or a long tom sluice box demands a continuous, copious flow. Many mining operations are entirely dictated by water availability. You might have the richest claim on the field, but if there's no water to wash your pay dirt, it's just so much useless gravel. This leads to endless competition and frequent, bitter disputes between groups of diggers for access to any functioning water race or creek frontage. Men might work through the night to divert a trickle of water to their claim, or build elaborate, leaky dams and channels from timber and canvas, all in a desperate bid to keep their operations going. Asking for still or sparkling water on the goldfields would likely earn you a very blank stare, possibly followed by an offer of a bit gritty today or extra crunchy, fresh from the bottom of the barrel. The health consequences of relying on these contaminated water sources are, as you can imagine, Severe diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever, which we touched upon in the context of your charming tent life, run rampant, spread largely through polluted water. Many a digger who survived the perilous sea voyage and the backbreaking labor of the diggings would succumb to a gut-wrenching illness contracted from a single, careless cupful of water. Some attempt to mitigate the risk by boiling their drinking water, a sensible precaution. But this requires precious time and even more precious firewood, which itself is becoming scarce around the larger fields as every available tree is felled. Others might try filtering the muddy water through a piece of cloth, or adding a pinch of alum if they can get it, to help settle the suspended solids, leaving a slightly less opaque, but still bacteriologically adventurous, beverage. Some diggers even claim they could discern the quality of a water source by its unique bouquet. Usually, this bouquet was a heady blend of eau de deceased sheep decomposing gracefully upstream, with a subtle hint of essence of communal laundry day performed with enthusiasm but limited soap. It's a historical fact that the critical need for reliable water supplies on the major goldfields eventually forced colonial governments to take action. Though often with frustrating slowness, large-scale engineering projects, such as the construction of aqueducts, reservoirs, and water races, were undertaken in places like Bendigo with the Coliban system of waterworks, and for Ballarat, to bring water from distant catchments to the thirsty diggings and the burgeoning towns. These were monumental undertakings for their time. But for many of the early rushes, such infrastructure was just a distant dream. For a quirky, if somewhat desperate, tidbit. Just as some diggers employed divining rods or looked for supernatural signs to locate gold, a few might have also applied these unscientific methods to the search for water. You might see a hopeful soul pacing the arid ground with a forked stick, earnestly concentrating, hoping to feel that telltale dip indicating a hidden spring. The success rate was, predictably, on par with finding a unicorn taking a refreshing bath in a champagne fountain. More often, a digger might recount a water dream, a vision of a clear, gushing spring in a particular gully, only to wake up and find the gully just as dry and dusty as his own parched throat. Historians still argue about the primary reasons for the often slow and inadequate official response to the critical water shortages on the goldfields. Was it mainly due to the immense engineering and logistical challenges of supplying water to such remote and rapidly shifting populations? Was it a simple lack of government foresight, will, or adequate funding? Or did a prevailing laissez-faire attitude towards the welfare of the diggers, seen by some as a rough and transient lot, contribute to the delays in implementing effective water management strategies? Whatever the combination of reasons, for you, the individual digger, the daily grind for water is as relentless and often as unrewarding as the grind for gold itself. Each carefully hoarded drop is a precious commodity, a lifeline in a parched and demanding land. That constant gnawing thirst and the often fruitless quest for clean water is a burden shared by almost everyone on these sprawling, chaotic goldfields. And everyone, you quickly realize, encompasses an astonishingly diverse and often bewildering array of humanity. The news of gold discoveries in Australia has acted like a global magnet, drawing in adventurous souls, desperate fortune seekers, and outright opportunists from every conceivable corner of the earth. As you navigate the dusty tracks of Canvastown, you're not just walking through a collection of tents. You're strolling through a living, breathing, shouting, and sometimes brawling United Nations of the 19th century, a truly cosmopolitan chaos. The dominant language you hear is, of course, English, but it's a rich tapestry of accents. There are the clipped tones of English gentlemen, perhaps down on their luck, the rich brogues of Irishmen, many fleeing famine and poverty, the lilting speech of Welshmen, and the broad, earthy burr of Scots. But listen closer, and the air hums with a dozen other tongues. You'll brush past grizzled American Yankees, veterans of the Californian rush of '49 instantly recognizable by their wide-brimmed hats, confident swagger, and perhaps a Colt revolver tucked casually into their belt. Groups of Germans, often skilled artisans or farmers, might be heard conversing in their guttural tones, perhaps lamenting the lack of decent lager. Frenchmen, Italians, and Spaniards add their more melodic, Romance languages to the mix, gesticulating passionately as they discuss the day's finds or the outrageous price of onions. Hardy Scandinavians, Poles, Hungarians, the list goes on. And significantly, you see the distinctive figures of Chinese diggers, their conical hats and practical blue cotton clothing setting them apart. Their presence a testament to the global reach of this golden fever, though their unique experiences and the harsh prejudice they often faced will warrant a closer look later in our journey. The Victorian goldfields in the 1850s? It's a well-established historical fact, were one of the most astonishingly multicultural places on the entire planet at that time, with a very significant percentage of the male population having been born overseas. It was like the world's most chaotic, under-catered, and incredibly dusty international potluck supper. Everyone brought their own language, their own peculiar style of hat, and their own deeply ingrained, often entirely baseless, suspicion of everyone else's cooking. This collision of cultures creates a vibrant, if often tense, social environment. Different nationalities bring with them their own customs, traditions, foods, or attempts to recreate them with limited ingredients, styles of dress, religious beliefs, and, importantly, their own methods and ethics regarding work and gold digging. You might see a group of Cornish miners, one with their long heritage of hard rock mining, employing techniques unfamiliar to others. The Irish, often forming close-knit communities, might celebrate a Saint's Day with impromptu music and dancing, much to the bemusement of their more reserved English neighbors. Tensions, alas, are inevitable. Old world prejudices and national rivalries don't simply vanish on the voyage out. Misunderstandings fueled by language barriers can quickly escalate into arguments, sometimes into fistfights. Stereotypes, often unflattering and unfair, are rife. There's a constant jostling for position, for resources, for respect. Trying to understand directions on the goldfields, for instance, is an adventure in itself. You just head past yon Irishman's tent, the one with a slightly singed pig picture. Then you turn left where you hear that very loud German fellow practicing his opera scales. And if you find yourself amidst a group of very animated Italians passionately debating the merits of garlic and damper, well then, laddie, you've gone a wee bit too far. Simple. Yet, amidst the potential for friction, the shared hardship, the common goal, and the sheer isolation from the wider world also forge unexpected bonds. The concept of mateship, so central to the Australian identity, finds fertile ground here. Men from vastly different backgrounds find themselves working side by side, sharing a tent, relying on each other for safety and support. An Englishman might find his best mate as an Irishman. A German might share his meager rations with an American. Necessity becomes the mother of cooperation, and sometimes even genuine friendship. You see distinct camps or neighborhoods forming within the larger sprawl of Canvas Town. There might be an Irish town, a Frenchman's Gully, or a German hill, where those of a similar background tend to congregate. Finding comfort in shared language and customs, these enclaves develop their own distinct characters, their own preferred sly grog shops, their own internal social codes. Communication between these groups and with the authorities is a constant challenge. A gold commissioner trying to explain a new regulation through a series of translators, or by resorting to increasingly frustrated sign language and shouting, is a common and often rather comical sight. International relations on the goldfields are frequently conducted via strongly worded gestures, enthusiastic and often mutually incomprehensible shouting, and the occasional, universally understood, diplomatic intervention of a shared bottle of something that vaguely, and probably deceptively, resembles rum. For a quirky tidbit, these rival national or ethnic groups might sometimes engage in competitive, though usually good-natured, displays of their cultural prowess. You might stumble upon an impromptu singing contest between a group of Welshmen, renowned for their choral traditions, and a group of lusty-voiced German Liederkranz enthusiasts, or perhaps a Highland Games materializes, with caber tossing improvised from conveniently sized tree trunks and wrestling matches drawing large, boisterous crowds. Culinary competitions, though hampered by the limited ingredients, might also occur, each group convinced that their particular method of torturing mutton and flour into submission is far superior. Historians still argue with considerable passion about the long-term societal impact of this intense, multicultural crucible. To what extent did the shared experience of the gold rushes truly foster a nascent Australian multiculturalism and a spirit of egalitarianism, where a man was judged by his efforts rather than his origins? Or did it primarily serve to reinforce existing ethnic hierarchies and ingrained prejudices, which were then carried forward into the developing colonial society, leading to later policies of exclusion and discrimination? The answer, like the goldfields themselves, is complex and multifaceted, a mixture of progress and prejudice, of camaraderie and conflict. For you, navigating this bewildering human soup, it's a daily lesson in diplomacy, tolerance, and the art of understanding a pointing finger and a hopeful grunt when words fail. You quickly learn that it's a truly cosmopolitan place when you overhear a Cornishman, his accent as thick as clotted cream, earnestly trying to teach a newly arrived Californian the correct and most effective way to swear at a stubborn mule in Gaelic, all while a dapper Frenchman looks on in utter bemused horror, probably contemplating the irreversible decline of Western civilization right there in a dusty gully. Navigating that bewildering, cosmopolitan soup of humanity, all driven by the glittering promise of gold and often lubricated by questionable grog, inevitably brings you face to face with the less savory side of human nature. For every honest digger toiling away, there are those who'd rather mine the miners, those who see opportunity not in the stubborn earth, but in the pockets, claims, and general vulnerability of their fellow fortune seekers. And so, you must also learn to navigate the murky world of frontier justice, the ongoing, often desperate struggle between the troopers, the forces of so-called law and order, and the various rogues who prey upon the goldfields. The rogues come in many guises. Perhaps the most romanticized, yet often brutal, are the bushrangers. These are the highwaymen of the Australian bush, lurking on the lonely tracks that connect the goldfields to the coastal cities. They prey on diggers heading to the fields with their meager savings, or more lucratively, on those returning hopefully laden with gold dust. They might hold up the lumbering mail coaches, or even, with audacious courage, attempt to stick up the heavily armed gold escorts that transport the official shipments of bullion. Names like Frank Gardner or Ben Hall would later become infamous, though their main period of activity was a little after the initial rushes of the early 1850s. The type of daring mounted bandit was certainly a clear and present danger from the outset. Their business model was brutally simple. You dig it, they nick it. Customer satisfaction, as you might imagine, was not a key performance indicator for their particular enterprise. Within the chaotic confines of Canvas Town itself, other varieties of scoundrel flourish. Claim jumpers, as we've touched upon, are a constant menace, always ready to move in on a promising claim if the rightful owner is careless enough to leave it unattended or appears unable to defend it. Then there are the sly grog sellers, operating from shadowy tents, peddling rot-gut spirits at outrageous prices. Their concoctions often adulterated with anything from tobacco juice to gunpowder to give them an extra, if perilous, kick. Gambling cheats abound, ready to fleece naive newcomers with rigged games of cards or dice. Pickpockets, tent thieves, and all manner of petty larcenists ply their trade amidst the crowds and the confusion. And let's not forget the smooth-talking confidence tricksters, with their plausible schemes for investing your hard-won gold dust in some fantastical, never-to-materialize enterprise. Attempting to keep a lid on this bubbling cauldron of potential criminality are the troopers, the Goldfield Police, usually mounted, clad in often stuffy, impractical uniforms of dark blue or green wool. They are the visible, if not always effective, arm of the law. These men, often former soldiers or new immigrants themselves seeking steady employment, are tasked with a multitude of duties checking for those hated mining licenses, patrolling the diggings, attempting to prevent fights and riots, arresting offenders, and generally trying to impose some semblance of order on a population that is largely armed, frequently intoxicated, and inherently resistant to authority. They are often vastly outnumbered, poorly paid, and deeply unpopular with the general digger population, who tend to view them with suspicion and resentment, derisively calling them traps, Joes, or blue bottles. A Goldfields trooper's unofficial job description probably included must be able to ride a horse for 12 hours a day in blistering heat, look suitably intimidating even when covered in dust and sweat, skillfully ignore a dozen simultaneous licensing infractions, endure a constant barrage of creative insults, and possess a superhuman ability to somehow not see that very obvious illegal two-up game happening right behind you. Above the troopers in the hierarchy are the Gold Commissioners, who, in addition to their administrative duties regarding claims and licenses, also act as magistrates, holding rudimentary courts to dispense justice. These courts might be held in a tent, or even in the open air, with the commissioner perched on a stump, listening to a confusing babble of accented testimony and attempting to deliver judgments that are both fair and enforceable. A truly Herculean task. The official lockups or jails on the Goldfields are often just as primitive as everything else, flimsy wooden structures or even just a heavy chain secured to a sturdy tree, from which escape is not entirely unheard of. The challenges for law enforcement are immense. The Goldfields are vast and difficult to patrol effectively. The population is transient, with men constantly arriving and departing. Witnesses to crimes are often reluctant to come forward, either out of fear of retribution or a general distrust of the authorities. And, inevitably, there are whispers of corruption, of troopers turning a blind eye to certain illicit activities in exchange for a share of the profits. If you were unfortunate enough to be robbed of your hard-earned gold dust, reporting it to the authorities was often an exercise in pure, unadulterated optimism. My gold dust? Officer. Oh, it was definitely stolen by a rather tall fellow, with a very suspicious-looking beard, wearing a somewhat disreputable hat, and he may or may not have been riding a brown horse. Any chance you've seen him in this seething metropolis of 30,000 similarly attired, equally suspicious-looking individuals? The trooper would likely just sigh, make a vague note in a damp ledger, and suggest you be more careful next time. Given the often perceived inadequacy of official justice, the diggers themselves sometimes resort to their own, more direct methods. Digger justice, or lynch law, though actual lynchings were rare, the threat was there could be swift and brutal. A notorious claim jumper or a persistent thief, if caught by a crowd of angry miners, might be subjected to a summary trial by a miners' committee. Punishments could include a flogging, having their tent and tools burned, being tarred and feathered though actual tar was scarce. A mixture of grease and flour or ash might suffice, or simply being drummed out of camp, forcibly marched off the goldfield with a warning never to return, often to the accompaniment of clanging pans and jeering. The gold escort provides a visible symbol of the wealth being extracted and the dangers involved in protecting it. These are heavily armed convoys, usually consisting of a sturdy wagon carrying chests of gold, guarded by a contingent of mounted troopers, making the perilous journey from the goldfields to the secure vaults in the major cities. They are a prime target for the more audacious bushranging gangs, and tales of daring and sometimes bloody attacks on the escort become the stuff of Goldfields legend. The general populace is also frequently armed. Many diggers carry a sheath knife as a utility tool, but pistols, muskets, and even sabers are not uncommon sights, kept for self-defense against both two-legged and four-legged predators, contributing to the general undercurrent of potential violence that simmers beneath the surface of daily life. A significant historical fact that underscores the volatile nature of law and order on the goldfields is the occurrence of serious disturbances and even outright riots, such as the murder of a gold commissioner at the Ovens Field in Victoria in 1853, or the later anti-Chinese riots at Lambing Flat in New South Wales. These events, and the ever-present threat of bushranging often forced colonial governments to significantly increase police numbers, build more secure infrastructure like courthouses and lockups, and reform aspects of Goldfield's administration in an attempt to maintain control and protect the crown's revenue. For a quirky tidbit, some of the more flamboyant bushrangers actively cultivated a Robin Hood-esque public image, entirely undeserved in most cases, claiming they only robbed the rich like the gold escort, which was seen as government money and were champions of the oppressed digger. These self-serving narratives, embellished with tales of daring escapes and gentlemanly conduct towards their victims, especially female ones, often found a receptive audience around the campfires, where any story that thumbed its nose at authority was generally appreciated. You might also hear hushed tales of a particularly inept local bushranger, whose attempts at highway robbery always seemed to go comically awry. Perhaps because his horse kept wandering off, or he always forgot his flintlock, turning him into more of a local joke than a genuine menace. Historians still engage in considerable debate regarding the true nature and motivations of bushranging during this period. Was it primarily a manifestation of desperate social conditions, an outlet for the frustrations of ex-convicts and the dispossessed who felt cheated by the system? Or was it more a reflection of straightforward, opportunistic criminality, simply thriving in a poorly policed, cash-rich frontier environment where the rewards seemed to outweigh the risks? It was probably a complex brew of both, with a dash of romantic myth-making thrown in for good measure. For you, the ordinary digger, it's just another hazard to navigate. Another reason to sleep with one eye open, and your small stash of gold if you have any hidden in a very, very clever place. Okay, here are sections 9, 10, and 11 of your bedtime history script, continuing the narrative of the daily grind in a 19th century Australian gold rush town. That very clever place where you've hidden your small stash of gold dust, perhaps sewn into the lining of your grimy waistcoat, or buried beneath a particularly unappealing patch of dirt under your flea-ridden blanket, is a testament to your constant vigilance against the rogues and bushrangers. But while you're busy guarding your hard-won specs from the outright thieves, another, often more insidious, drain on your meager resources is operating in plain sight, with a cheerful smile and an open ledger. These are the shopkeepers, the merchants, the publicans, the myriad service providers who have flocked to the goldfields not to wield a pickaxe themselves, but to wield the far more consistently profitable tools of commerce. It's time to explore how these shrewd entrepreneurs were often the ones mining the miners, striking the real, reliable gold without ever dirtying their own hands with wash dirt. As you wander through the chaotic main thoroughfare of Canvastown, if such a muddy, rutted track can be dignified with that term, you're bombarded by a cacophony of commerce. Crude storefronts, often just larger tents with canvas awnings or hastily erected timber shacks with ambitious, hand-painted signs, jostle for your attention and your precious gold dust. General store, provisions and implements, screams one. Licensed victualler, fine ales and spirits, proclaims another, its definition of fine being remarkably elastic. Butcher, fresh mutton daily, mostly bought goodwise. Assay office, gold bought here, at our generous prices. The air hums not just with the clang of picks, but with the jingle of coins, though gold dust, weighed out on small scales, is often the preferred currency and the persuasive patter of salesmen promising everything from a cure for dysentery to a shovel that practically finds gold by itself. You quickly learn that if something sounds too good to be true on the goldfields, it almost certainly involves you parting with a significant portion of your gold for something of dubious value, like a patent gold divining hat that mostly just attracts more flies. The storekeepers are the undisputed kings of this commercial jungle. They are the gatekeepers of essential supplies, and they know it. Flour, tea, sugar, salt, tobacco, candles, matches, mining tools, rough clothing, boots. Everything you need to survive and continue your quest for gold passes through their hands. And with each transaction, a little bit of your potential fortune sticks to theirs. Prices are, to put it mildly, exorbitant. A simple shovel that might have cost a few shillings in Melbourne or Sydney can sell for pounds on the diggings. A bag of flour, a side of bacon, a bottle of pickles, all command prices that would make a modern-day luxury goods retailer blush. The storekeeper will explain with a sorrowful shake of his head that these high prices are due to the terrible state of the roads, the immense cost of cartage by slow-moving bullock teams, the risks of spoilage, and the general uncertainty of life. And while there's some truth to this, there's also a healthy dose of opportunism. They have a captive market, and they're not shy about exploiting it. Their unofficial motto is probably something along the lines of, "Your desperate need is my delightful profit margin." Now, about that slightly rusty pickaxe you were admiring, a bargain at only 3 times its actual worth. Then there are the publicans and sly grog sellers, catering to the digger's enduring thirst for something stronger than tea or muddy water. Licensed publicans, operating from slightly more substantial timber buildings, offer ale and spirits, often alongside basic accommodation in crowded dormitories. But for every licensed establishment, there are dozens of illicit sly grog tents, hidden away in the labyrinthine alleys of Canvas Town, selling fiery, often adulterated concoctions that promise temporary oblivion, but frequently deliver a splitting headache, an empty pocket, and a profound sense of regret. The troopers might occasionally raid these establishments, tipping out barrels of grog and finding the proprietors, but new ones spring up as quickly as mushrooms after rain, the profits being too tempting to resist. Beyond the essentials, a whole ecosystem of other services emerges. Blacksmiths are in constant demand, sharpening picks, repairing tools, and shoeing horses. Carpenters build crude furniture, sluice boxes, and the occasional slightly more permanent hut. Barbers offer shaves and haircuts, perhaps with a side of tooth pulling if you're feeling particularly brave or desperate. Laundresses, though few and far between, charge princely sums to wash your filthy clothes in the polluted creek water. There are quack doctors peddling miracle cures, letter writers for the illiterate, and even itinerant preachers trying to save souls amidst the mammon worship. And, of course, there are the gold buyers and assayers, ready to weigh your precious dust and give you cash or store credit in return, always, you suspect, at a rate that slightly favors their side of the scales. It's a historical fact that many of the most enduring fortunes made during the Australian gold rushes were not made by the diggers themselves, but by these merchants and entrepreneurs who supplied their needs. Men like Cobb and Co., the famous coaching company, made fortunes transporting passengers, mail, and goods including gold across the vast distances. Large mercantile firms established branches on the gold fields, importing goods on a massive scale. These businesses, while facing their own risks and challenges, operated on a more predictable and sustainable model than the boom and bust lottery of actual gold digging. While you're out there battling heat stroke and dysentery for a few glittering specks, the fellow selling you the shovel and the salt pork is steadily accumulating a much more reliable pile of your hard-earned cash. For a quirky tidbit, some of the services offered were truly bizarre or hilariously opportunistic. You might encounter someone selling genuine Goldfield air bottled from a supposedly lucky spot, or another offering maps to lost reefs that looked suspiciously like they'd been drawn by a child after consuming too much sugar. There were also entertainers, musicians with battered fiddles, singers of sentimental ballads, even the occasional traveling theatrical troupe performing Shakespeare in a drafty tent to a bewildered but appreciative audience of homesick diggers. Anything to separate a digger from his gold. One particularly enterprising individual might even offer a Goldfields etiquette and deportment class, promising to teach rough and ready diggers the finer points of polite conversation and how to avoid accidentally offending a gold commissioner with an ill-timed belch. For a small fee. Of course. Lesson 1, try not to address the commissioner as mate when he's fining you for not having a license. That'll be 2 shillings, thank you. The relationship between the diggers and the storekeepers is complex, one of mutual dependence, but also often tinged with resentment. Diggers rely on the stores for their very survival. but they chafe at the high prices and the perceived exploitation. Credit is sometimes extended, but at ruinous interest rates, trapping many in a cycle of debt. Disputes over the quality of goods, the accuracy of weights and measures, or the fairness of prices are common, sometimes flaring into angry confrontations or even organized protests. Historians still argue about the overall economic impact and ethical dimensions of this mining the miners phenomenon. Were these entrepreneurs simply responding to market forces in a high-risk, high-cost environment, providing essential services that would otherwise be unavailable, or were many of them exploitative monopolists, price gouging a vulnerable population and profiting excessively from the diggers' desperate circumstances? The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the middle, a spectrum from honest traders providing a valuable service to outright charlatans and profiteers. But for you, the weary digger, as you hand over a significant pinch of your hard-won dust for a moldy loaf of bread and a rusty tin of sardines, the distinction often feels academic. You just know that your dream of striking it rich is funding someone else's much more certain path to prosperity, while you, our weary male digger, are busy funding the storekeeper's prosperity and dreaming of apples. It's crucial we don't forget another significant, though often historically overshadowed, group of individuals who are also navigating this chaotic, dusty world, carving out their own existence and contributing in vital ways to the fabric of Goldfield society. These are the women of the rush, the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters, but also the single adventurers, the entrepreneurs, the workers, the unseen pillars who brought a semblance of domesticity, commerce, and sheer resilience to these overwhelmingly masculine environments. The narrative of the gold rushes often conjures images of rugged men toiling in the dirt, and while numerically men did dominate, women were present from the very beginning, their numbers increasing as the fields became more established. Their reasons for being there were as varied as the men's. Some accompanied their husbands or fathers, driven by family loyalty or economic necessity, unwilling to be left behind. Others came as independent individuals, seeking their own opportunities, perhaps escaping limited prospects or societal constraints elsewhere. And yes, some undoubtedly came specifically to mine the miners in ways that went beyond selling overpriced flour, offering companionship, entertainment, or other services in high demand. Life for women on the goldfields was exceptionally challenging. They faced all the same hardships as the men, the squalid living conditions in tents, the poor sanitation, the scarcity of fresh food and clean water, the constant threat of disease, the isolation, and the often unforgiving Australian climate. But they often did so while also shouldering the primary responsibility for domestic labor, which, in such primitive conditions, was an endless, backbreaking task. Imagine trying to keep a tent even remotely clean, cook edible meals over an open fire with limited and poor quality ingredients, wash clothes in muddy creek water, and care for children, all while your husband is off chasing the elusive glitter and perhaps returning empty-handed and ill-tempered. It required a level of fortitude and resourcefulness that is truly awe-inspiring. Their home was a canvas sieve, their kitchen a smoky fire pit, and their childcare center often the dusty patch of ground outside the tent, where keeping a toddler from wandering into an open mine shaft or befriending a venomous snake was a full-time, high-stakes occupation. But many women were far more than just domestic support. They were active economic participants, seizing opportunities with remarkable entrepreneurial spirit. One of the most common and visible roles for women was that of the alewife or sly grog seller, which we've encountered before. Running a tent that offered a bit of cheer, a place to socialize, and a potent, if sometimes questionable to drink, could be a lucrative, if risky, business. Others became laundresses, a physically demanding but essential service. Given the general state of digger hygiene, you might see them down by the creek, scrubbing clothes on rocks, their hands raw, their backs aching, charging handsome prices for their labor. Some women ran makeshift boarding houses or eating establishments, offering a slightly more civilized meal than the average digger could manage for himself, or a cot in a shared tent for a nightly fee. The comfort food offered by a woman who could actually bake a decent pie or a recognizable scone, even in the most primitive conditions, was probably worth more than its weight in gold to a homesick, mutton-weary digger. Mrs. Higgins' mutton pies now, with 15% less indescribable grit. The sign might proudly, if somewhat optimistically, in a proclaim, women also worked as storekeepers, seamstresses, and even, in some cases, directly in mining alongside their male relatives, panning for gold or helping to operate cradles. There are accounts of women staking their own claims or forming their own mining partnerships. And, of course, there were those involved in the entertainment industry, singers, dancers, actresses in the rough-and-tumble theaters and concert halls that sprang up, offering a fleeting escape from the daily grind. The presence of women, however small their numbers initially, had a profound impact on the social atmosphere of the goldfields. Their very existence often served as a civilizing influence, a reminder of a world beyond the immediate, brutal pursuit of gold. The establishment of families, however rudimentary their living conditions, began to transform the temporary camps into more settled communities. It's a historical fact that the gender imbalance on the early goldfields was extreme, with men outnumbering women by a huge margin. This scarcity, ironically, sometimes gave women who were present a certain degree of social leverage or economic opportunity they might not have had in more conventional colonial society. However, it also exposed them to significant risks. The goldfields were rough, often lawless places, and women could be vulnerable to harassment, exploitation, or violence. Yet, the historical record is also filled with stories of their resilience, their courage, and their ability to not only survive but also to thrive and contribute meaningfully. For a quirky tidbit, you might encounter women who became local legends for their particular skills or eccentricities. Perhaps there was an Auntie Bess who was renowned for her potent herbal remedies, or her even more potent home-brewed ginger beer, or a Mademoiselle Fifi who ran a surprisingly sophisticated for a tent dressmaking service, creating fashionable bonnets for the few ladies who aspired to such things amidst the dust. Some women, out of necessity or choice, adopted more masculine attire and demeanors to navigate the male-dominated environment, becoming formidable figures in their own right. You might see a woman confidently handling a bullock team or bargaining fiercely with a storekeeper, her presence challenging the prevailing gender norms. Historians still debate the extent to which the gold rush experience was genuinely liberating for women, offering them new economic freedoms and social agency, versus the extent to which it simply transplanted existing patriarchal structures and hardships into a new, even more challenging environment. For many, it was undoubtedly a period of immense struggle and sacrifice. But for others, it represented a chance to break free from conventional roles, to demonstrate their capabilities, and to build a new life, however difficult, on their own terms or as vital partners in a shared enterprise. Their stories, often less documented than those of the male diggers and entrepreneurs, are nonetheless crucial to understanding the full picture of life and the daily grind in these extraordinary pop-up cities of gold. The goldfields weren't just built on the sweat of men. They were also built on the tenacity, adaptability, and often unacknowledged labor of women. That tenacity and adaptability, demonstrated by both men and women, was constantly tested not just by the arduous labor, the harsh environment, and the often disappointing search for gold, but by an even more insidious and indiscriminate enemy sickness. Your flimsy tent, your monotonous diet of mutton and damper, the polluted water, and the sheer density of unwashed humanity crammed together create a perfect breeding ground for disease. And when illness or injury strikes on the 19th century Australian goldfields, your options for effective medical care are, to put it mildly, terrifyingly limited. So let's take a deep, fortifying breath, hopefully, of relatively clean air and confront the ever-present perils of sickness and sorrow that cast a long shadow over the glittering dream of gold. The list of potential ailments is long and grim. Dysentery, often called colonial fever, the blight, or simply the fluxes, is rampant. Caused by bacteria or amoebas, usually ingested through contaminated food or water, it leads to debilitating diarrhea, dehydration, and often death, especially in the young, the old, or the already weakened. Typhoid fever, another waterborne scourge, brings high fevers, delirium, and intestinal hemorrhage. Influenza, measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria sweep through the crowded camps with terrifying speed, finding easy victims in a population whose resistance is already lowered by poor nutrition and exhaustion. And then there's scurvy, that grim consequence of a diet devoid of fresh fruit and vegetables, leaving you with bleeding gums, loose teeth, aching joints, and an overwhelming lethargy that makes even lifting a pickaxe an impossible task. You might see a fellow digger, hale and hearty one week, rapidly decline the next. His dreams of fortune replaced by a desperate fight for life, a fight too often lost. The goldfields, you quickly realize, are not just a place of golden opportunity, but also a place of profound and often swift mortality. The local undertaker, if such a formal profession even exists yet beyond a few blokes with a shovel and a willingness to dig another hole, is probably doing a brisker trade than many of the gold seekers. Accidents are another constant companion to the daily grind of mining. The work is inherently dangerous. Shafts, often poorly timbered and dug through unstable ground, can collapse without warning, burying miners alive. Men fall down unfenced or poorly lit mud holes. Especially at night, primitive explosives, used for blasting through hard rock, sometimes misfire or are handled carelessly, leading to horrific injuries. Rock falls, equipment failure, the simple slip of an axe or a pick, all can result in broken limbs, crushed hands, severe lacerations, or worse. Even something as seemingly minor as a deep cut from a rusty tool can quickly become life-threatening if infection sets in, which, in these unhygienic conditions, is almost a certainty. The sounds of the goldfields are not just the clang of tools and the murmur of voices, but also, too frequently, the sudden cry of pain, the urgent shouts for help. And what happens when you fall ill or suffer a serious injury? Your access to medical care is rudimentary at best. On the larger, more established fields, a few doctors might set up practice, often in tents just as flimsy as yours. Some of these are undoubtedly qualified medical men, perhaps ship's surgeons who have jumped ship to seek their fortune, or recent graduates from European universities. But many are self-proclaimed healers, quacks, and charlatans, armed with little more than a glib tongue, a few dubious patent medicines, and an optimistic approach to amputation. Their diagnostic tools are limited, their understanding of infection control non-existent, and their pharmacopoeia often consists of harsh purgatives, opium-laced concoctions, and a general belief in bleeding or blistering the patient into submission, or at least into a state where they're too weak to complain about the treatment. A visit to a goldfields doctor could be a lottery as risky as staking a new claim. You might get lucky and find someone competent and compassionate, or you might find yourself being prescribed a poultice made of questionable herbs and sheep dung, with a stern instruction to sweat it out and hope for the best. Well, my good man, the doctor might say, peering at your gangrenous leg with a thoughtful frown, I have two excellent options for you, this rather potent tincture of hope and laudanum, or this slightly rusty but impressively large saw. Decisions. Hospitals in the early days are virtually non-existent. Perhaps a larger tent is designated as an infirmary, staffed by a few well-meaning but untrained volunteers, offering little more than basic shelter and a place to die with a modicum of privacy. As towns develop, rudimentary benevolent asylums or small hospitals might be established through charitable efforts or government initiative. But these are often overcrowded, under-resourced, and struggling to cope with the sheer volume of sickness and injury. It's a historical fact that the lack of organized medical infrastructure and public health measures on the early goldfields was a major crisis, leading to appallingly high death rates, particularly from epidemic diseases. The official records of deaths, often incomplete, paint a grim picture of the human cost of the rush. For those who fall seriously ill or are gravely injured, the care often falls to their mates. Comradeship and loyalty run deep, and diggers will often go to extraordinary lengths to nurse a sick friend, sharing their meager rations, fetching water, and sitting by their side through the long, feverish nights. But good intentions can only do so much in the face of virulent disease or catastrophic injury. The sorrow of watching a mate succumb, far from home and family, is a heavy burden many have to bear. Funerals are frequent, simple, and somber affairs. A rough wooden coffin, if one can be afforded or made, a shallow grave dug in the hard earth, perhaps a few heartfelt words spoken by a friend or an itinerant preacher. For a quirky, though rather grim, tidbit, the epitaphs on some of the rough wooden grave markers, if any exist, can be starkly eloquent in their simplicity. John Smith died of fever, aged 23, or lost down a shaft. Sometimes they hint at the unfulfilled dreams, came seeking gold, found only rest. There might also be a brisk trade in last wills and testaments, hastily scribbled on scraps of paper, or dictated to a literate mate as men confronted their own mortality. And of course, there are the countless unmarked graves, their occupants lost to history, their stories untold. Historians still debate the precise demographic impact of disease and accidents on the goldfields. While its clear mortality was high, the exact rates and the primary causes of death are sometimes difficult to ascertain definitively from the often patchy historical records. Furthermore, there's discussion about the extent to which the authorities could have realistically mitigated these health crises given the knowledge and resources of the time, versus the degree to which the diggers' own behaviors, their disregard for sanitation, their dietary choices, or their sometimes reckless mining practices, contributed to their own demise. It's a sobering reminder that the glittering lure of gold often came at an incredibly steep and very human price. The daily grind wasn't just about finding gold. For many, it was about simply surviving until the next sunrise. Okay, here are sections 12, 13, 14, and 15 completing your bedtime history script on the daily grind in a 19th century Australian gold rush town. That grim roll call of sickness and sorrow, the constant battle for basic health in a hostile environment, is a burden shared by almost everyone on the diggings. But for one particular group, these universal hardships were compounded by unique cultural challenges, targeted prejudice, and often outright violence. As you navigate the sprawling, multifaceted society of Canvas Town, you cannot help but notice the distinctive presence of miners from the Celestial Empire, the Chinese diggers, and it's time to understand their unique experience, their remarkable contributions, and the harsh discrimination they so often faced. They arrive in their thousands, drawn by a different name for this land of golden dreams, Xinjinshan, the new gold mountain. For many, the journey from the southern provinces of China is an escape from poverty, famine, or the turmoil of civil unrest like the Taiping Rebellion. They often come not as lone adventurers, but in organized groups, perhaps under a credit ticket system where their passage is paid by a merchant or a clan association, an advance they must laboriously repay from their earnings on the goldfields. You see them, their appearance setting them apart practical. Loose-fitting blue or dark cotton jackets and trousers, wide-brimmed conical hats woven from straw or bamboo to shield them from the fierce Australian sun. And for many, their hair worn in a queue, a long braid, as mandated by the Qing dynasty. Their camps, often established slightly apart from the main European diggings, are marvels of organization and industry. While European miners might work in small, often haphazard partnerships, the Chinese frequently operate in larger, highly coordinated teams. They are renowned for their incredible patience, their meticulousness, and their ability to extract gold from ground that European diggers have already worked and abandoned as useless. They will painstakingly rewash tailings, carefully sift through discarded mullock heaps, and employ water-saving techniques born of experience in a land where that resource was also precious. When the European diggers, after casually tearing through a patch of earth like a particularly enthusiastic wombat in a vegetable patch, declared it worked out, The Chinese teams would often move in, apply a bit of quiet diligence and meticulous engineering, and somehow coax out enough fine gold to make a modest living. It was almost as if they were whispering secrets to the very dirt that the other blokes, in their haste and bluster, hadn't bothered to learn. Their contributions extend beyond just gold mining. Many Chinese establish market gardens on the fringes of the goldfields, coaxing life from the often unpromising soil to produce fresh vegetables, cabbages, onions, carrots, a desperately needed and highly prized addition to the monotonous mutton and damper diet of the European diggers. These vegetables not only provide vital nutrition, helping to combat scurvy, but also represent a significant commercial enterprise. Others become merchants, setting up stores that cater to their countrymen but also trade with Europeans, or work as cooks, laundrymen, or herbalists, offering traditional Chinese remedies. Their cultural footprint is also visible the occasional, small, ornately decorated joss house, or temple. A place of worship and community gathering, stands as a vibrant splash of color and tradition amidst the drab canvas. Communication between the Chinese and European diggers is often a significant challenge. Imagine the sheer comedic potential and inherent frustration of trying to explain the complex rules of cricket to someone using only a series of increasingly elaborate gestures and a hopeful, slightly strained smile, while they, in turn, are attempting to initiate you into the subtle intricacies of Fantan or Mahjong using a similar method. Mostly, it ends in a lot of confused nodding, some polite bowing, and perhaps a shared, if somewhat bewildered, cup of tea. Despite their industry and their generally peaceable nature, the Chinese diggers face appalling discrimination and hostility. Driven by a toxic cocktail of racial prejudice, fear of economic competition, and profound cultural ignorance, many European miners view them with suspicion and outright animosity. They are labeled as heathen, alien, and unclean. Their different customs, their language, their appearance, their very success in extracting gold where others have failed, all breed resentment. This simmering prejudice frequently erupts into violence. It's a dark historical fact that anti-Chinese sentiment on the goldfields led to some of Australia's earliest and most shameful pieces of discriminatory legislation, such as the Victorian Chinese Immigration Act of 1855, which imposed a hefty poll tax specifically on Chinese arrivals and severely limited the number of Chinese passengers a ship could carry. This was followed by similar acts in other colonies, all designed to restrict Chinese immigration. Furthermore, horrific events like the Lambing Flat riots in New South Wales in 1860-61 or the Buckland riot in Victoria in 1857 saw large mobs of European diggers brutally attack Chinese camps, destroying property, looting gold, and inflicting terrible violence, often with little effective intervention from the authorities. The European idea of exotic food on the goldfields, as you know, was probably mutton cooked in a slightly different, perhaps even more burnt manner. Then the Chinese arrived with actual spices, fresh vegetables from their gardens, and entirely new ways of preparing food, and suddenly everyone else's campfire cuisine looked, and probably tasted, even more tragically bland and uninspired, which perhaps only added to the resentment for some. Yet, in the face of such adversity, the Chinese communities demonstrate remarkable resilience and solidarity. They rely on their strong social networks, their district and clan associations, which provide mutual support, financial assistance, and a framework for resolving internal disputes. They maintain their traditions, celebrate their festivals like Chinese New Year with whatever resources they can muster, and find ways to endure, and sometimes even prosper, in an often deeply hostile environment. For a quirky tidbit, amidst the hardship, they establish their own forms of entertainment and cultural expression. You might, on a quiet evening, hear the distinctive sounds of Chinese opera, the clash of cymbals, the high-pitched singing, drifting from their camp. A strange and exotic sound to European ears. They had their own gambling games, their own storytellers, their own ways of finding solace and community far from their ancestral homes. Some of the anti-Chinese propaganda circulated at the time was truly imaginative in its breathtaking absurdity. Accusations ranged from the predictable, "they're stealing all our gold," often while meticulously working tailings no one else deemed worthwhile, to the utterly bizarre, such as their traditional pigtails are clearly a secret antenna system for communicating directly with the moon and plotting global domination. Fear, ignorance, and envy, it seems, make people say and believe the most extraordinarily strange things. Historians still engage in robust debate about the primary drivers of this intense anti-Chinese sentiment on the 19th century goldfields. Was it predominantly a matter of economic competition, a fear amongst European diggers that the Chinese, with their willingness to work for smaller returns and their highly organized labor, were depressing earnings and taking their gold? Or was it rooted more deeply in pre-existing racial prejudice and xenophobia, a manifestation of white colonial anxieties about cultural purity and the perceived threat of an alien influx? Or, perhaps most likely, was it a toxic combination of all these factors, fueled by cultural misunderstandings, anxieties about the changing social landscape of the colonies, and the deliberate stirring of racist sentiment by certain sections of the colonial press and political opportunists? Whatever the ultimate balance of causes, the experience of the Chinese diggers remains a poignant and often troubling chapter in the story of the Australian gold rushes, a testament to both human resilience and the enduring stain of prejudice. That resilience, shown by the Chinese diggers and indeed by all who endure the hardships of the goldfields, is often sustained by a fragile, yet incredibly potent, thread, the connection to home, to loved ones left behind, to a life that exists beyond the dust, the desperation, and the digging. In an age long before instant messaging, video calls, or even reliable telephone communication, the primary link to that distant world is the humble, painstakingly written, and anxiously awaited letter. Let's explore how news, hope, and hardship were communicated across the vast, unforgiving distances that separated the Australian goldfields from the rest of the globe. The tyranny of distance is a palpable thing here. You are, quite literally, at the ends of the earth. A letter posted from England, Ireland, Germany, or China might take 3, 4, even 6 months to reach you, braving perilous sea voyages, storms, shipwrecks, and then the final, arduous overland journey to the specific goldfield where you might, or might not, still be. And a reply, if you are able to send one, will take just as long on its return journey. This vast gulf of time and space weighs heavily on the heart. Months pass without word. Anxieties fester, and the world you left behind can feel like a fading dream. Waiting for a letter from home is an exercise in extreme, almost Zen-like patience. You could stake a new claim, dig a 50-foot shaft that yields absolutely nothing, go broke, sell your tools, and seriously contemplate a new career as a professional wombat botherer in the agonizingly long time it takes for your dear mother's letter, primarily asking if you're remembering to wear clean socks and attend church, to finally find its way to you. The postal system, in these early days of the rush, is often as chaotic and rudimentary as everything else. While mail ships eventually arrive at the major colonial ports like Melbourne or Sydney with their precious cargo of letters and newspapers, getting that mail to the remote, ever-shifting inland goldfields is another challenge altogether. Initially, it might rely on private contractors, packhorse services, or the occasional enterprising individual heading to the diggings with a sack full of letters for a fee. As the rushes intensify, more organized mail coach services, like those famously run by Cobb & Co., begin to operate, their sturdy coaches and teams of horses thundering along the rough tracks, carrying passengers, gold, and the all-important mailbags. These coaches become vital lifelines, their arrival in a gold rush town an event of great excitement. The Goldfields post office itself is often just another tent, perhaps slightly larger and more official-looking than yours, with a harried postmaster attempting to sort through mountains of mail addressed with optimistic vagueness. The scene outside the Posto Restante window, where letters addressed to individuals without a fixed abode are held for collection, is a daily scrum of anxious faces, men pushing and shoving, desperately hoping to hear their name called. The Goldfields Post Office, you surmise, is less an office in the traditional sense and more a tent of utter bewilderment and fading hope, where a single, perpetually stressed out man with a prominent facial tic and possibly an eye patch tries to decipher addresses scrawled as Big Jono, currently digging somewhere near the creek with the suspiciously dead-looking gum tree, vicinity of Ballarat. Good luck with that, Big Jono. The content of these letters, when they finally arrive, is a poignant mix of the mundane and the momentous. Letters from home bring news of births, deaths, and marriages, updates on local gossip, expressions of love and concern, and often, gentle or not, so gentle inquiries about when some gold might be sent back to alleviate hardship at home. Letters from the diggings are equally varied. Some are filled with wild optimism, perhaps exaggerating small finds into grand discoveries to impress the folks back home or to justify their decision to emigrate. Others are stark accounts of the relentless hardship, the sickness, the loneliness, the disappointment. Many contain desperate pleas for news or for money to fund the return journey. For those diggers who are illiterate, and there are many, the services of a public letter writer are essential. These individuals, often possessing a reasonable hand and a florid turn of phrase, will, for a fee, transcribe dictated messages, acting as crucial intermediaries. Of course, this reliance on a third party means that private sentiments are no longer private, and the accuracy of the transcription depends entirely on the writer's skill and integrity. Newspapers also play a vital role in this information ecosystem. Even in the most primitive canvas towns, small, locally printed newspapers spring up with astonishing speed. Titles like the Digger's Advocate, the Ballarat Star, or the Bendigo Advertiser. These sheets, often just a few pages long and printed on ancient, clanking presses, are filled with local news from the diggings. Reports of new rushes, some accurate, some wildly speculative. Shipping intelligence announcing the arrival and departure of mail ships. Advertisements for everything from mining tools to patent medicines. And often fiery editorials on the political issues of the day, particularly the hated mining license. Because many diggers cannot read. A common sight is one literate man reading the newspaper aloud to an attentive, often opinionated group gathered around a campfire or in an alehouse. This public reading of the news is a performance art in itself. You have to really commit. Do all the indignant voices for the angry letters to the editor about the price of mutton. And try your utmost to make the shipping news and lists of unclaimed letters sound as gripping and potentially life-changing as a confirmed report of a new, incredibly rich gold strike just over the next hill. In the absence of timely or reliable official news, rumors spread like wildfire through the dense populations of the goldfields. A whisper about a big nugget found in a previously overlooked gully. A hint of a government crackdown on sly grog selling. A story about a bushranger attack. These tales fly from tent to tent, often becoming more exaggerated and dramatic with each retelling. Particularly disruptive are the shicers, completely false reports of new, rich gold strikes, sometimes deliberately started by mischievous individuals or those hoping to draw population away from a crowded area. A convincing shicer can empty a section of the diggings faster than a cry of free beer and no license checks. Aye, men will abandon perfectly good claims, pack their meager belongings, and stampede off for miles across rugged country, driven by the fear of missing out, only to find the massive new discovery is nothing more than a patch of barren quartz, a suspiciously shiny rock, or, more embarrassingly, someone's discarded lunch tin glinting in the sun. It's a historical fact that the gold rushes dramatically accelerated the development of postal services and intercontinental communication. The sheer volume of mail generated by the tens of thousands of new immigrants and the economic importance of timely information spurred investment in faster ships, more regular mail routes, and eventually The laying of submarine telegraph cables that would, by the later 19th century, begin to shrink that immense tyranny of distance. For a quirky tidbit, diggers sometimes developed ingenious, if low-tech ways to communicate or to ensure the safety of their correspondence. Given the public nature of mail collection and the risk of letters being stolen or misdirected, some might use coded phrases or nicknames in their letters to family to convey sensitive information about their finds or lack thereof without alerting unwelcome attention. A man might write, "Aunt Matilda is feeling much better," as a prearranged code for "I've struck a decent patch." Others, sending small amounts of gold dust home, might carefully conceal it within the wax seal of a letter or sew it into the lining of a seemingly ordinary piece of clothing being sent back with a returning friend. Historians still debate the true literacy rates among the diverse gold rush population and the extent to which the surviving letters, often preserved precisely because they were written, accurately reflect the common experience, particularly of those who could not read or write. How much of the daily news, the social cohesion, and the shared understanding of events was actually driven by this oral culture of rumor? Campfire storytelling, public newspaper readings, and face-to-face gossip, rather than by the written word, the echoes from home, whether carried on paper or on the wind, were a fragile but vital lifeline, connecting the harsh realities of the goldfields to the memories, hopes, and enduring affections of a world left far behind. Those echoes from home, whether bringing joy, sorrow, or simply the reassurance of continued connection, serve as a constant reminder of the life you've temporarily or perhaps permanently left behind in your quest for gold. But as weeks turn into months, and months into years, for many on the diggings, another, more troubling, set of echoes begins to resonate the whispers of fading fortunes. The dawning realization that the easily won surface gold is becoming harder and harder to find, and that the vibrant, chaotic boomtown you arrived in might be starting to lose its Midas touch. You are about to witness the inevitable downside of the gold rush, the anxieties of decline, the dust of disappointment, and the melancholy shuffle of departures. Gold rushes, by their very nature, are finite. The initial excitement is fueled by easily accessible alluvial gold, nuggets and dust found in creek beds, shallow surface deposits, or just beneath the topsoil, often obtainable with simple tools like pans and cradles, but these surface riches are quickly exhausted by the sheer number of miners. As the easy pickings dwindle, the character of the goldfield begins to change. You notice the signs subtly at first. There are fewer triumphant shouts announcing a big find. The yields from your own claim, and those of your mates, become progressively smaller, requiring more backbreaking labor for fewer specks of color. The new rushes that occasionally ignite a flicker of hope now more often turn out to be duffers, false alarms leading to barren ground, and men return more quickly, their faces grim with disillusionment. Chasing these duffer rushes becomes the goldfield's equivalent of following a particularly unreliable and frankly malicious GPS that seems to take a perverse delight in leading you into impenetrable thorn bushes or extensive swampy areas. Guaranteed massive gold strike just over yonder hill. The rumor would shriek, usually translating in reality to someone appears to have lost a shiny brass button and got rather overly enthusiastic about it. The physical appearance of Canvas Town itself starts to subtly alter. While new hopefuls still trickle in, a growing number of disillusioned diggers begin to pack their meager belongings and drift away. You see more abandoned tents, their canvas flapping forlornly in the wind, their former occupants having moved on to try their luck at another rumored strike. Return to the cities in defeat, or perhaps even scraped together enough for the passage back to whatever distant land they called home. The bustling thoroughfares seem a little less crowded, the cacophony of mining activity a little less intense. Storekeepers, who once extended credit with a confident smile, now eye your request for flour or tobacco with a more calculating, less generous gaze. Their shelves, once groaning with overpriced goods, might start to look a little bare as they become hesitant to reorder stock for a dwindling population. The first clear sign a particular goldfield is seriously on the wane. It's probably when the local storekeeper starts offering dusty old stock, 2 for 1, deals on slightly rusty pickaxes, and actually makes an effort to remember your name and ask about your family. The heady boom times, you realize with a sinking heart, are officially over. The responses to this fading fortune are varied. Some diggers, the eternal optimists or those with more resources, attempt to chase the gold deeper. This means sinking more perilous shafts, investing in more expensive machinery like steam-powered pumps to deal with underground water, or forming larger companies to work quartz reefs that require crushing machinery. This is a different kind of mining, requiring more capital, more engineering skill, and often more danger. Others, particularly the patient and meticulous Chinese teams, might find continued, if modest, success by painstakingly reworking the ground abandoned by the earlier, more impatient rushes, using their water-saving techniques to extract the fine gold that others missed. Many, however, face a stark choice. Some try to diversify. A digger with a bit of carpentry skill might try to find work building more permanent structures as the camp slowly transitions into a slightly more settled village. Another might invest his last few specks of gold in a couple of scrawny bullocks and try to make a living as a carter. Some might attempt to cultivate a small patch of land, hoping to sell vegetables to the remaining population. But for many, the only option is to leave. The great exodus begins, sometimes a trickle, sometimes a flood, as men chase the rumor of a new strike in some distant, as yet unspoiled gully, always hoping that the next place will be the one where their fortune lies. The main exports of a declining gold town, it often seems, quickly become dust, disappointment, and a stream of diggers with exceptionally well-developed shoulder muscles from ceaseless digging, and a profoundly cynical outlook on the general reliability of get-rich-quick schemes. This period of decline brings its own set of social anxieties. With less gold being found, competition for what remains can become even fiercer. Tensions rise. Theft and claim jumping might increase as desperation sets in. The camaraderie forged in the early days of shared hope can fray under the pressure of shared disappointment. The psychological toll is immense. The bright flame of gold fever, which once burned with such intensity, flickers and dims, often replaced by a gnawing anxiety, a quiet despair, or a simmering bitterness at dreams unfulfilled. The popular campfire songs might shift from boisterous celebrations of lucky finds to more melancholic tunes, perhaps something along the lines of the old digger's lament. I remember when this gully had nuggets thick as fleas. Now all I get is rheumatize and holes right through my dungarees. My pan is cracked. My hope is gone. My beard is streaked with gray. Oh, why did I leave County Cork to chase the gold away? It is a historical fact that many, if not most, of the hundreds of Australian gold rush towns experienced this rapid boom and bust cycle. Once the easily accessible alluvial gold was exhausted, their populations plummeted. Some vanished almost entirely, leaving behind nothing but scarred landscapes, a few rotting timbers, and the ghosts of forgotten hopes, true ghost towns. Others ought, however, manage to survive and transform. If there were discoveries of deeper, more extensive quartz reefs requiring industrial mining, or if the location was suitable for agriculture, or if the town had developed as a significant regional service center, it might find a more sustainable, if less frantic, path to the future. For a quirky tidbit, as a goldfield entered its twilight years, you might see the emergence of scavengers or fossickers, often old, stoic characters, or families with no other options. These individuals would eke out the barest of livings by meticulously picking over the vast plains of abandoned mullock heaps, or by patiently repanning the silted-up creek beds for the tiniest, almost invisible specks of gold missed by the initial waves of miners. They were the human cleanup crew of the gold rush, gleaning the last forgotten crumbs. Or you might find the very last publican in a rapidly emptying town, his establishment now a cavernous, echoing space, offering everything must go, including this remarkably questionable barrel of rum. sails in a final desperate attempt to liquidate his stock before he too packs his bags and seeks greener, or perhaps golder, pastures. Historians still actively debate the primary factors that determined which of these ephemeral gold rush towns managed to survive and evolve into lasting settlements, and which simply faded back into the bush. Was it purely a matter of underlying geology? The presence or absence of extensive deep reef gold that could support long-term industrial mining? Or did geographical location, access to other crucial resources like permanent water and fertile land, the adaptability and resilience of the remaining population, or even deliberate government policies and investment in infrastructure play more significant roles in shaping their ultimate destinies for you? Watching the hopeful glow in your fellow digger's eyes slowly dim, replaced by a weary resignation, it's a stark reminder that all that glitters is not, in the long run, sustainable gold. That weary resignation, the sight of dwindling fortunes and departing comrades, marks the fading of a particular kind of dream for you and many an individual digger. But as the dust settles on one abandoned claim, and the clamor of one boomtown softens to an echo, it's time to step back and witness how this chaotic, transformative, and often brutal period of gold fever didn't just enrich a few and disappoint many, it fundamentally reshaped a continent and played a crucial role in forging a new nation. The legacy of the Australian gold rushes extends far beyond the scarred landscapes and the ghost towns. It's woven into the very fabric of modern Australia. The demographic impact alone was staggering. Before gold, the European population of Australia was relatively small, predominantly Anglo-Celtic, and largely concentrated in coastal settlements. The gold rushes triggered a massive surge in immigration. Unlike anything seen before, hundreds of thousands of people poured in from Great Britain, Ireland, continental Europe, America, China, and elsewhere. As we've seen, this influx dramatically increased the overall population, altered its ethnic composition, and accelerated the inland spread of settlement. The gold rush, you could say, was Australia's slightly chaotic, incredibly dusty, and occasionally explosive national gap year. It went away a quiet, pastoral teenager and came back with a bulging wallet for a host of weird new international friends, a few bad habits, and a whole swag of stories it would be telling for generations to come. Economically, the impact was monumental. The sheer volume of gold extracted, literally tons of it, provided an enormous injection of wealth into the colonial economies. This wealth fueled the rapid growth of cities like Melbourne and Sydney, transforming them from provincial outposts into bustling, sophisticated metropolises. It's a historical fact that the riches from the Victorian goldfields in particular were instrumental in enabling Melbourne to become, by the 1880s, one of the wealthiest cities in the entire British Empire, renowned for its grand public buildings, burgeoning industries, and vibrant cultural life. This newfound wealth financed the construction of railways, roads, telegraph lines, universities, libraries, and galleries, laying the essential infrastructure for a modern nation. Before the gold rushes, Australia's international reputation was largely built on sheep and sunshine. After the gold rushes, it became known for gold, sunshine, and a populace that was surprisingly adept at complaining vociferously about the price of mutton while simultaneously digging very large and occasionally profitable holes in the ground. The social and political landscape was also irrevocably altered. While the dream of egalitarianism on the goldfields, where any man, regardless of birth or background, could theoretically strike it rich, was often more myth than reality. The experience did contribute to a questioning of rigid class structures and a fostering of more democratic sentiments. The diggers' assertion of their rights, most famously culminating in the Eureka Stockade Uprising in Ballarat in 1854, over the hated mining licenses and lack of political representation, became a potent symbol of popular resistance to arbitrary authority and a catalyst for democratic reforms, including the introduction of the secret ballot and manhood suffrage for white men, at least in some colonies. The goldfields also saw the early seeds of trade unionism, as miners began to organize to protect their interests, particularly as mining became more industrialized. The concept of mateship, that uniquely Australian bond of loyalty and mutual support forged in shared hardship, is often seen as having been deeply entrenched during this period. This idea of mateship was probably truly forged when two blokes, covered in mud and flies, realized they both profoundly detested the same opportunistic storekeeper, the same leaky tent they were forced to share, and the same infuriating inability to find any actual gold, and simply decided, then and there, to be utterly miserable together in solidarity, a noble, if slightly downbeat, beginning for a national ideal. However, it's crucial to acknowledge the darker aspects of this legacy. The rapid influx of settlers and the expansion of mining activities led to further dispossession and devastation for Aboriginal populations, as their traditional lands were overrun, their water sources polluted, and their way of life irrevocably disrupted by conflict and disease. This remains a painful and complex part of the gold rush story. The racism experienced by Chinese and other non-European miners also cast a long shadow, contributing to the development of discriminatory policies that would shape Australian immigration law for decades to come. Culturally, the gold rushes left an indelible mark. They generated a rich body of folklore, songs, poems, and stories, tales of lucky strikes, notorious bushrangers, eccentric characters, and tragic failures. The distinctive language of the diggings, a colorful mishmash of terms from various cultures, contributed many unique words and phrases to the Australian vernacular. For a quirky tidbit, common Australian slang expressions such as fair dinkum true, genuine, fossick to search or rummage, especially for gold, duffer an unproductive mine or a failure, and to pan out to be successful, all have their roots firmly planted in the rich, loamy soil of the gold rush era. The shared experience of the rushes, with its blend of optimism, hardship, and rugged individualism, helped to shape a nascent Australian identity. The landscape itself bears the permanent scars and successes of this era. Vast areas were cleared of timber, river systems were altered, and the earth was pockmarked with shafts and mullock heaps. Some of these sites are now heritage areas, preserving the physical reminders of this transformative period. And, of course, many of the towns that boomed during the rushes, if they survived the inevitable bust, grew into the established regional centers we know today. Historians still vigorously debate the overall balance of the gold rush's legacy. Was it primarily a positive nation-building force that spurred democratic progress, economic prosperity, and cultural dynamism? Or did its undeniable benefits come at too high a cost in terms of environmental destruction, social dislocation, the entrenchment of racial prejudice, and the profound and lasting dispossession of Indigenous Australians? The answer, most likely, is that it was all of these things, a complex, contradictory, and defining chapter in the nation's story. And so, as the last echoes of the pickaxe fade and the imaginary dust of Canvastown begins to settle in your mind, our journey through the daily grind of a 19th century Australian gold rush town draws to a close. You've walked those rutted tracks, felt the sting of the sun, the ache of your muscles, the pang of hunger, and perhaps even the fleeting thrill of finding a tiny speck of color in your pan. You've encountered the myriad souls drawn from across the globe, each with their own hopes and their own hardships, all caught up in a fever that reshaped their lives and the destiny of a continent. The world you visited was one of stark contrasts, of incredible wealth found amidst abject poverty, of fierce independence alongside profound mateship, of boundless optimism set against crushing despair. It was a raw, elemental, and often brutal existence, stripped bare of niceties, where survival itself was a daily victory. The challenges were immense, the rewards uncertain, but the human spirit, in all its flawed and resilient glory, endured. As you drift now towards sleep, perhaps you can still hear the faint, distant sounds of that bygone era, the creak of a windlass, the murmur of voices around a campfire, the hopeful tap-tap-tap of a pick against unseen stone. The gold may now mostly reside in museums and bank vaults. The canvas towns may have long since vanished into the dust, but the echoes of that incredible transformative rush continue to resonate. A foundational story in the land down under. May your own dreams tonight be peaceful, and perhaps, just perhaps, tinged with a tiny sparkle of gold. End of script. Sweet dreams.